slap on some labels, twist the meaning, and top it all off with a hefty dose of fakes. Russian propaganda is once again trying to divide Ukrainian society. The negotiations in Istanbul, the situation around Nabu and SAP, prisoner exchanges, all of this has become a pretext for new information attacks. So, what methods is the Kremlin using, and for what purpose? Let's break it down. At the beginning of this week, Russian propagandists paid special attention to the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine. First, they broadcast a dose of lies on TV about the supposed mobilization of pensioners. Then they lied that the parliament had voted on a resolution about the assortment of alcoholic beverages in the cafeteria. By the way, this information was accompanied by a fake photo with an unclear scoreboard and a bunch of mistakes. And on July 22nd, after the adoption of the bill on the powers of anti-corruption agencies, Kremlin media completely switched their focus to this topic. For example, Putin's press secretary Peskov claimed that the Ukrainian authorities had supposedly stolen billions from the United States and the European Union, and that's why such a law was urgently needed. At the same time, on talk shows, so-called experts were slinging mud at both the Ukrainian parliament and president on one hand, and Nabu and SAP on the other, claiming that they serve the interests of the U.S. Democratic Party. The American Institute for the Study of War even released a special report on this matter. It emphasizes that Moscow, and I quote, uses protests in Ukraine as a weapon aimed at undermining Kiev's legitimacy and discouraging the West from providing support.
Russia uses protests in Ukraine to create the illusion of internal division and to suggest that Ukrainians are tired of the conflict. This is part of the Kremlin strategy to prolong the war, weaken Western support, and gain an advantage on the front lines. The overwhelming majority of funds allocated by the U.S. to Ukraine are actually spent in the United States, not in Ukraine. A significant portion of U.S. and European military aid goes toward funding activities related to the war, including training Ukrainian forces and providing intelligence support to both NATO and Ukraine. From a report by the Institute for the Study of War.
Everything that happened at the protests, Russian propaganda also tried to twist and distort, not shying away from any methods. For example, there were such rumors being spread, and I quote, "The Security Service of Ukraine is offering a free pizza promo code for any information about protest participants." Of course, this kind of nonsense was primarily aimed at a domestic audience. But footage of peaceful Ukrainian protests played a cruel joke on the Kremlin authorities. People remember very well how, at rallies in Russian cities, those who simply came out with a blank sheet of paper were thrown into police vans, how people who laid flowers at monuments to victims of political repression were arrested based on denunciations, or how a child was expelled from school for a drawing with the words, "We want peace, not war," and the father received a real prison sentence.
To war! No to war. It just hurts. It hurts. It just hurts. It hurts. It just hurts. Yes!
I demand that you immediately cease your unlawful actions. Good job. I repeat, I demand that you stop your unlawful actions. Go home. Where are you?
Are you Persian?
That's it. They've taken him away.
In order to sow discord between Ukraine and its partners, the Kremlin will continue to distort facts, using any pretext for this, twisting any situation upside down. This is well understood in the Kremlin, in Brussels, and in Washington. Here, for example, is what the Washington Post writes about this.
Indeed, if this were Russia, Vladimir Putin would have sent his thugs to break up the protests and arrest the demonstrators. But since this is Ukraine, people can protest freely without fear of retribution. Instead of calling the demonstrators traitors or foreign agents, Zelensky said in his address to the nation on Wednesday evening, "Everyone has heard what the people are saying." This has not been ignored. From a publication by the Washington Post.
Let us recall that on July 24th, President Volodymyr Zelensky submitted a new bill on anti-corruption agencies to the Verkhovna Rada for consideration. Moreover, Both the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine and the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office stated that this document fully guarantees their independence.
As of today, my bill is already in the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine. What I promised for the sake of justice, for law enforcement and anti-corruption agencies, full guarantees of independence for anti-corruption bodies, real opportunities to verify that there is no Russian interference. Everyone who has access to state secrets, not only in NABU and SAP, but also in the State Bureau of Investigation and our national police, must undergo polygraph tests. And these must be regular checks. There are also provisions in the draft law that protect against various abuses. The text of the draft law was discussed with partners, law enforcement, and representatives of NABU and SAT. Many proposals from our partners suggested involving European experts from the UK, Germany, and the European Union. I instructed our officials to present the draft law to all our partners and to engage all necessary expert resources. And of course, it's important that Ukrainians are responding to all these events with such dignity. Ukraine is made up of people who care.
The new round of negotiations in Istanbul also became a reason for Russian media to launch another wave of disinformation. So, many publications reported that the heads of the negotiating teams from Ukraine and Russia, Rustem Umerov and Vladimir Medinsky, supposedly met in person behind closed doors, and according to Russian propagandists, they allegedly discussed what concessions Kiev should make. In reality, the meeting took place with the mediation of Turkey's Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan. And there was no talk of any concessions there. The Ukrainian side stated its demands as clearly as possible: a ceasefire, the return of all prisoners, and the return of Ukrainian children abducted by Russian occupiers. Kiev also initiated a meeting between President Volodymyr Zelensky and Putin, with the participation of the leaders of Turkey and the United States, to take place by the end of August.
By agreeing to this proposal, Russia will be able to clearly demonstrate its constructive approach to everyone in the world, including our partners. Ukraine continues to insist on a complete and unconditional ceasefire as a necessary foundation for effective diplomacy.
By spreading fake news about Istanbul, the Kremlin was pursuing several goals at once: to undermine trust in the Ukrainian delegation within the country, and to create the impression that it is Kiev blocking the peace process. This was the case after both the first and the second rounds of negotiations. In addition, the Kremlin was actively pushing the topic of prisoners of war. Supposedly, the Russians are returning home exhausted. But here, it's enough to simply look at photos and videos of Ukrainian and Russian prisoners of war to understand that this is a cynical lie, just like everything the head of the Russian delegation, Medinsky, said about Ukrainian children abducted by Russia. And there will be no fewer such manipulations and fakes. After all, it seems that the Kremlin has no intention of negotiating a lasting peace or stopping this bloody war.